The day my ex-husband laughed at my apartment was the day I realized some people only measure success by what they can see. My name is Emily Carter, and 3 years after my divorce, I was living in a one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of an aging brick building in Columbus, Ohio. The paint in the hallway was chipped. The elevator worked only when it felt like it. The parking lot needed repairs. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place people assumed you ended up after life went wrong. I never bothered correcting them, especially not Jason. My ex-husband had always been confident. Some would call it confidence. Others would call it arrogance. During our marriage, he worked in finance and loved appearances. He drove expensive cars, wore expensive watches, and treated every conversation like a competition. After our divorce, he moved into a luxury condominium downtown and made sure everyone knew about it. I moved into my little apartment and made sure nobody knew anything about me. Most people thought I struggled financially after the divorce. I let them think that. My daughter, Sophie, was 16 when this story began. She split her time between my apartment and Jason's high-rise condo. One Saturday afternoon, I hosted a small birthday gathering for Sophie. Nothing extravagant, just homemade food, a few decorations, and some close relatives. I spent the morning preparing everything myself. By noon, family members started arriving. Sophie was laughing with her cousins in the living room when Jason knocked on the door. The moment he stepped inside, I saw his eyes scan the apartment. The old kitchen cabinets, the modest furniture, the narrow hallway. He smiled in a way I immediately recognized. It was the smile he wore whenever he believed he had won something. "Still living here?" he asked. Several relatives glanced toward us. I simply nodded. "It seems a little small for you," he continued. "I figured you would have upgraded by now." I smiled politely. "It works for me." He laughed softly. "Well, as long as you are comfortable." Then he looked around again and added, "I guess not everyone has the same ambitions." The room suddenly became very quiet. Sophie lowered her eyes. My sister looked uncomfortable. Even Jason's brother appeared embarrassed. But I refused to. The following Monday began like most others. At 8 o'clock in the morning, I sat in a small office on the first floor of the building reviewing maintenance reports and tenant requests. Most people assumed I worked somewhere else. Officially, I did. The family company that managed the property operated under a different name, and very few people connected me to it. That arrangement had existed for years. My father believed privacy was one of the greatest forms of protection, and after inheriting his business interests, I continued operating the same way. While Jason spent his energy impressing people, I spent mine solving problems. That morning alone, I approved repairs for a leaking roof section, reviewed estimates for elevator upgrades, and signed contracts for landscaping improvements. None of it felt glamorous. Yet those ordinary decisions were the reason the property remained successful. Around noon, my phone buzzed. It was Sophie. "Mom, are you free after school?" she asked. "Of course. Dad wants me to attend some event with him this weekend. Something about a real estate project." I smiled slightly. Columbus was full of real estate projects. "Do you want to go?" I asked. "Not really. It sounds boring." "Then tell him that." She laughed. "You make everything sound simple." Maybe it was simple. One thing I learned after my divorce was that life becomes easier when you stop living to satisfy other people's expectations. Later that afternoon, I walked through the building. I greeted residents by name. Mrs. Henderson from apartment 214 showed me photographs of her new grandson. A young couple on the second floor thanked me for responding quickly to a maintenance issue. An elderly veteran stopped me in the lobby just to talk about baseball. Moments like those mattered to me. To outsiders, the building was a financial asset. To me, it was a community. Every apartment contained a different story. Every family carried different challenges and dreams. That evening, I attended a quarterly meeting with our management team. During the presentation, one of the executives discussed a major redevelopment opportunity. Several investors wanted to partner on a large modernization project involving our property and neighboring land parcels. The estimated value exceeded $20 million. The room buzzed with excitement. "Interest is increasing quickly," one manager explained. "Several financial groups are already preparing proposals." I listened carefully, but said little. Then a familiar name appeared on the screen. Miller Capital Advisors. Jason's firm. For a moment, the room seemed unusually quiet. Nobody else noticed my reaction. They simply continued discussing numbers, timelines, and projections. Apparently, Jason's company wanted a role in financing the redevelopment. The irony almost made me laugh. He spent years assuming I could barely afford my apartment while simultaneously pursuing a business opportunity connected to the property I owned. I returned home that night and stood by the same window overlooking the courtyard. Lights glowed from dozens of apartments. Somewhere nearby, families were eating dinner together. Children were finishing homework. Ordinary life continued without any awareness of the situation unfolding behind the scenes. A few days later, Sophie joined me for dinner. Halfway through the meal, she mentioned Jason again. Dad is really excited about that development project. I kept my expression neutral. Is he? He says it could be one of the biggest deals his company has worked on this year. She paused. Honestly, he talks about it all the time. I nodded and continued eating. He said the property owner is probably some huge investment company from New York or Chicago. I nearly smiled. Maybe. Sophie studied me. You seem amused. Do I? A little. She laughed. Sometimes I feel like you know things other people do not. If only she knew how accurate that statement was. As the weeks passed, discussions surrounding the redevelopment intensified. Contractors visited the property. Survey teams measured land boundaries. Financial analysts prepared reports. Jason became increasingly involved in negotiations, convinced he was moving closer to one of the most important projects of his career. Meanwhile, I continued living in my modest apartment exactly as before. The same furniture, the same routines, the same quiet life. People often assume wealth changes everything. In reality, it only reveals what already matters to you. And while Jason focused on appearances, deadlines, and deal structures, he remained completely unaware of one simple fact. Every proposal, every meeting, every financial model, and every ambitious plan eventually required approval from the person he had spent years looking down on. The first time I saw Jason connected to the redevelopment project in person was nearly 6 weeks later. The management company organized a preliminary planning session at a downtown conference center. Representatives from investment firms, engineering groups, construction companies, and financial institutions attended. Normally, I would have remained behind the scenes as I always did, but this project had reached a stage where I needed a closer look. Even then, I attended quietly. Nobody introduced me as the owner. Nobody treated me differently. To most people in the room, I was simply another executive reviewing reports. From across the conference hall, I spotted Jason speaking confidently with several investors. He stood exactly as I remembered from our marriage. Perfect posture, expensive suit, easy smile. The kind of man who always believed he understood the room better than everyone else. A large presentation screen displayed architectural renderings of the property. New landscaping, updated apartments, modern community spaces, improved parking structures. The plans were impressive. I listened carefully as consultants explained timelines and projected returns. Every few minutes, Jason contributed observations. Several people seemed genuinely impressed by his expertise. To be fair, he was good at what he did. That had never been the issue. The issue was that he often mistook confidence for understanding. During a break, I walked toward a refreshment table. I almost made it across the room unnoticed. Almost. Emily. I turned and found Jason standing beside me. His surprise lasted only a second before his usual confidence returned. I did not know you were involved in this project. I am attending the meeting, I replied. He nodded slowly. Interesting. His eyes moved briefly toward the presentation materials. Thinking about investing? I nearly laughed. Something like that. He smiled. Well, this project is much larger than most people realize. There it was again. That familiar assumption. The belief that he possessed information unavailable to everyone else. I am sure it is, I said. The ownership group has been difficult to reach. They keep everything private. I took a sip of coffee. Privacy can be useful. He shook his head. Not in business. Visibility matters. I decided not to argue. Experience had taught me that some lessons cannot be explained. They must be discovered. Before leaving, he lowered his voice slightly. For what it is worth, I am glad things seem to be improving for you. The statement sounded almost kind. Almost. Yet it carried the same assumption hidden beneath every conversation we had shared since the divorce. He still believed I was rebuilding my life. He still believed I was struggling quietly while he moved ahead. Thank you, Jason, I said. That is thoughtful. He smiled and returned to his group of investors. The meeting continued throughout the afternoon. By the time it ended, one thing had become clear. Competition for involvement in the project was intensifying. Several firms wanted exclusive positions. Others were preparing revised proposals. Everyone focused on securing approval from the mysterious ownership group. Nobody suspected the woman who lived in apartment 3B had final authority. A few days later, I received a request for a formal presentation from all interested financial partners. The event would take place the following month. Major stakeholders would attend. Final recommendations would be reviewed. Important decisions would be made. As I read the schedule, I noticed Jason's company had secured one of the primary presentation slots. That evening, Sophie stopped by after school. She dropped her backpack near the sofa and immediately began talking about college applications. The conversation drifted from universities to career goals and eventually toward family. "Dad has been acting strange lately," she said. "How so?" "He keeps talking about one project over and over. He says it could change everything for his company." I smiled. "He sounds excited. Maybe too excited." She laughed. "Honestly, sometimes I think both of you enjoy keeping secrets." I raised an eyebrow. "Do I keep secrets?" "Absolutely." Her answer came instantly. "You always know things before everyone else." I could not argue with that. Later that night, after Sophie left, I opened the same drawer that contained my father's old keychain and ownership documents. Beside them sat a sealed folder prepared by our legal team. Inside were final approvals, redevelopment agreements, and one additional document that would soon make secrecy impossible. For years, I had no reason to reveal my role publicly. That was about to change. I closed the drawer and looked out across the courtyard once again. The building appeared exactly as it always had. Quiet, ordinary, unremarkable. Yet within a few weeks, hundreds of people would learn the truth about who owned it. And among them would be the one person who had spent years believing he knew exactly how my story ended. The closer we moved toward the final redevelopment presentation, the more attention the project attracted. Local business journals published articles about it. Investors discussed it during networking events. Real estate professionals described it as one of the most significant redevelopment opportunities in Columbus that year. Everyone seemed fascinated by the future of the building. Ironically, almost nobody paid attention to its present. That suited me perfectly. One morning, I arrived early at the management office and found several messages waiting on my desk. Contractors needed approvals. Attorneys requested signatures. Financial advisors wanted clarification regarding ownership disclosures that would accompany the final announcement. For years, my name remained intentionally hidden behind corporate structures established by my father. Everything had been legal, transparent, and properly documented. But once redevelopment began, public disclosure would become unavoidable. Soon everyone involved would know exactly who controlled the property. I reviewed the documents carefully. The truth was no longer something I could keep private. Later that week, I attended another planning session downtown. This time the room felt noticeably different. The competition among financial groups had intensified. Several firms believed they were close to securing lucrative partnerships. Jason appeared especially confident. Throughout the meeting, he spoke about future projections, financing strategies, and long-term growth opportunities. Investors listened carefully. Some even took notes when he spoke. Watching him from across the room, I could understand why people trusted him. He projected certainty. Confidence attracts attention. Unfortunately, confidence sometimes blinds people to what they fail to see. During a break, I overheard two consultants discussing the mysterious owner. "Whoever owns that building is sitting on a gold mine," one said. "Probably some investment group from New York." The other nodded. "Nobody local keeps that kind of profile." I quietly stirred my coffee and said nothing. Across the room, Jason laughed with several executives. The assumptions continued. Nobody questioned them because nobody had reason to. The following weekend, Sophie joined me for lunch. We visited a small restaurant overlooking the river. As usual, our conversation moved between school, friends, and future plans. Then she brought up her father again. "Dad seems really stressed lately." I raised an eyebrow. I thought he was excited about the project. "He is. But I think he wants everything to go perfectly." She paused. "Sometimes it feels like he needs people to know he is successful." Her observation surprised me because it sounded remarkably mature. "Why do you think that?" I asked. Sophie shrugged. "I do not know. Maybe because he talks about it all the time. She smiled. You are different. Different how? You never talk about money. I laughed softly. There are more interesting things to talk about. She studied me for a moment. Sometimes I wonder if I know everything about you. I nearly smiled. If she only knew. The next few weeks passed quickly. Legal teams finalized agreements. Construction schedules were reviewed. Media invitations were distributed. The official redevelopment announcement was scheduled for the following month at a large conference venue downtown. Hundreds of attendees would be present. Investors, city officials, journalists, business leaders. The event would reveal the future of the property and formally introduce ownership to the public. One evening, Jason unexpectedly called me. We rarely spoke unless the conversation involved Sophie. I wanted to ask you something, he said. All right. Would Sophie like to attend the redevelopment announcement? For a moment, I simply listened. Why? It could be educational, business leaders, community development, networking opportunities. I smiled despite myself. You sound like you were giving a sales presentation. He laughed. Maybe I am. Then his tone softened slightly. It is important to me. I will ask her. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my apartment. Outside, lights illuminated the courtyard exactly as they had every evening for years. The building looked ordinary, familiar, comfortable. Yet in less than a month, everything would change. Not because ownership was changing. Ownership had not changed in years. What would change was perception. The story people told themselves about the building. The story Jason told himself about me. The next morning, I unlocked a secure cabinet in my office and removed a presentation folder prepared by our attorneys. Inside were final ownership records, redevelopment agreements, and the official introduction that would be read publicly during the announcement ceremony. I reviewed the documents one final time before closing the folder. My name appeared clearly on every page. No hidden entities. No mystery. No assumptions. Just facts. For years, people looked at my apartment and believed they understood my circumstances. Soon those assumptions would meet reality. And for the first time since the divorce, Jason would finally discover that the woman he spent years feeling sorry for was never the person he imagined. The morning of the redevelopment announcement arrived with an unusual sense of calm. For months, attorneys, planners, investors, and consultants had worked toward this day. Yet as I stood in my apartment making coffee, everything felt strangely ordinary. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window. Residents crossed the courtyard on their way to work. Somewhere down the hall, a neighbor walked a dog. Life continued exactly as it always had. The difference was that by the end of the day, a secret I had carried for years would no longer belong only to me. Around 9 o'clock, I arrived at the conference venue downtown. The event occupied a large ballroom filled with business leaders, city officials, journalists, and financial representatives. Registration tables lined the entrance. Display screens showcased architectural renderings of the future development. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Everyone wanted to know who would shape the next chapter of the property. I moved quietly through the crowd, greeting attorneys and project managers. Most attendees recognized me as someone involved in the process, but few understood my actual role. That was about to change. A few minutes later, I spotted Jason near the front of the room. He looked completely confident. Several investors stood around him discussing projections and financing structures. He shook hands, smiled for photographs, and spoke with the certainty of someone expecting a successful outcome. Watching him, I remembered the day he stood inside my apartment and suggested that everyone deserved better than a place like this. The memory no longer hurt. If anything, it seemed distant. Time has a way of removing emotion from old wounds. Sophie arrived shortly before the presentation began. She had decided to attend after all. When she found me near the side of the ballroom, she smiled. "This place is huge," she whispered. "It is an important project," I replied. She glanced around the room. "Dad seems nervous." I followed her gaze. For the first time all morning, I noticed small signs of tension beneath Jason's confident exterior. He checked his phone repeatedly. He reviewed notes. He adjusted his time more than once. The stakes were obviously high. Soon guests took their seats. Conversations quieted. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone. One by one, speakers discussed economic growth, community investment, and redevelopment opportunities. Charts appeared on giant screens. Market forecasts were presented. Applause echoed through the ballroom. Eventually, Jason's company delivered its presentation. He spoke well. He always did. Investors listened carefully. City officials nodded in approval. When he finished, the audience applauded enthusiastically. Jason returned to his seat, looking satisfied. Then came the final portion of the event, the formal introduction of ownership and project leadership. The master of ceremonies returned to the stage carrying a folder. My folder. The room gradually became silent. Before we conclude today's program, he said, we would like to recognize the individual whose long-term vision made this redevelopment possible. Several people leaned forward. Others exchanged curious glances. Years of speculation were about to end. The property at the center of this project has remained under the same ownership for years, he continued. Its owner has chosen to operate privately while investing consistently in the community and its residents. Across the ballroom, I noticed Jason sitting a little straighter. Like everyone else, he expected a name he had never heard before. A corporation, a trust, a national investment group. Instead, the speaker smiled and said, "Please join me in welcoming Emily Carter." For a moment, nobody moved. Then hundreds of eyes turned toward me. The silence felt almost unreal. Sophie looked stunned. Several executives appeared confused. Journalists immediately began whispering among themselves. And Jason simply stared. I rose from my chair and walked calmly toward the stage. Every step seemed to stretch longer than the last. When I reached the podium, the room remained remarkably quiet. The expression on Jason's face was impossible to miss. Confusion, disbelief, recognition, all arriving at once. He looked from me to the presentation screen, then back to me again as though searching for an explanation. The explanation was simple. It had always been simple. The woman living in apartment 3B was not renting a small unit because she had nowhere else to go. She lived there because she chose to. And while others spent years judging what they saw through a window, they never bothered to ask who held the keys to the front door. For several seconds after I reached the podium, the ballroom remained completely silent. The expression on Jason's face was something I had never seen before. It was not embarrassment. It was not anger. It was the look of someone realizing an assumption he had carried for years was completely wrong. I adjusted the microphone and looked across the audience. Investors, city officials, reporters, consultants, and business leaders all waited for an explanation. Most of them were trying to connect the woman they had just seen walk onto the stage with the property they believed belonged to a major investment group. In a way, I understood their confusion. My entire life had been built around avoiding attention rather than seeking it. "Thank you for being here today," I began. My voice sounded calm, even to me. Many people have spent years discussing this building, studying this property, and speculating about its future. Today, I would like to talk about something different. I would like to talk about community. The giant screens behind me displayed photographs of the property throughout the years. Families moving into apartments, residents attending holiday gatherings, children playing in the courtyard, longtime tenants standing beside neighbors who had become friends. I spoke about my father and the values he believed should guide responsible ownership. He always said a building was more than brick and concrete. It was a collection of lives, a place where people built futures, a place where memories were created. As I continued, the atmosphere in the room gradually changed. The audience stopped focusing on ownership and started listening to the story. By the time I finished describing our plans for modernization, affordable housing protections, and community improvements, the room was completely engaged. When the presentation ended, applause filled the ballroom. Not because of me, because people finally understood the vision behind the project. Then came the question and answer session. Reporters immediately raised their hands. Several asked about redevelopment timelines. Others wanted details regarding financing structures. One journalist asked the question everyone seemed curious about. Why remain anonymous for so many years? I smiled. Because ownership was never the important part. Stewardship was. Several people nodded. The answer seemed to surprise them. In today's world, many people work hard to be noticed. My father taught me that meaningful work often happens when nobody is paying attention. Eventually, the formal program concluded. Guests stood and began gathering in small groups throughout the ballroom. Conversations erupted everywhere. Journalists requested interviews. Investors approached with questions. City officials offered congratulations. Through it all, I remained surprisingly calm. The truth had finally been revealed, and nothing about my life felt different. Then I noticed Jason walking toward me. The crowd seemed to part naturally as he approached. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply looked at each other. Finally, he shook his head slowly. "You own the building." I smiled gently. "Yes." He looked almost amused by the absurdity of it all. "The entire building." "Yes." Another silence followed. Then he laughed quietly, not out of mockery, but disbelief. All these years, I agreed. He glanced around the ballroom before lowering his voice. "Why did you never tell me?" The answer came easily. "You never asked." His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough to reveal that he understood exactly what I meant. Throughout our marriage and long after our divorce, Jason believed he already knew who I was. He never felt the need to ask deeper questions because he assumed he already had the answers. "I suppose I deserve that," he said. "This is not about deserving anything." For the first time that afternoon, his confident business persona disappeared completely. "I really thought you were struggling." I nodded. "I know. And I treated you like you needed my sympathy. Sometimes." He looked away briefly. "I was wrong." Those 3 words carried more weight than any apology could have. Not because they validated me. I stopped needing validation a long time ago. They mattered because they reflected growth. The ability to admit a mistake is rare, especially when pride is involved. Before either of us could say more, Sophie appeared beside us. Her eyes moved back and forth between her parents. "I cannot believe this," she said. "You own the whole building?" I laughed. Apparently everyone is surprised. She wrapped her arms around me and shook her head. "Mom, you are impossible." Standing there between my daughter and my former husband, I realized something important. The real victory was never the property. It was never the money. It was never proving anyone wrong. The real victory was building a life so secure that other people's opinions no longer determined its value. And for the first time in years, it seemed Jason was finally beginning to understand that too. The days following the announcement were far quieter than most people expected. Reporters published articles. Business journals discussed the redevelopment project. Industry professionals analyzed investment projections. Yet when I returned home each evening, the building felt exactly the same. Residents still greeted one another in the hallways. Children still crossed the courtyard after school. Elderly neighbors still gathered on benches to talk about weather, sports, and family. The attention surrounding ownership seemed enormous to outsiders, but daily life continued without much change. That reality made me smile. A week after the event, I walked through the property reviewing renovation schedules with our management team. New landscaping plans had been approved. Elevator modernization would begin later in the year. Several common areas would be updated. The goal was never to transform the building into something unrecognizable. The goal was to improve it while preserving the community people already loved. As we finished our inspection, Mrs. Henderson from apartment 214 stopped me near the lobby. "Congratulations," she said warmly. "For what?" I asked. She laughed. "For finally letting everyone know what you have been doing all these years." Her response reminded me of something important. The residents who mattered most were not surprised by the announcement. They knew me. They saw me walking the property. They saw me solving problems. They saw me listening. Ownership documents had simply confirmed what they already understood. Later that afternoon, Sophie visited after school. She still seemed fascinated by the revelation. "I cannot believe you kept this secret for so long," she said as we sat in my kitchen. "It was not really a secret." "Mom, you owned an entire building." I smiled. "Yes, that definitely counts as a secret." We both laughed. Then her expression softened. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Were you ever tempted to tell Dad just to prove him wrong?" The question lingered for a moment. "No," I answered honestly. "Why not?" I looked out the window toward the courtyard below. Because proving someone wrong is a temporary victory. Building a meaningful life is permanent. Sophie sat quietly, considering the answer. "I think I understand." I hoped she did. One of the most valuable lessons I learned after my divorce was that not every misunderstanding requires correction. Sometimes people reveal more about themselves through their assumptions than through their questions. A few days later, I received an unexpected invitation from Jason. He asked if we could meet for coffee. The request surprised me because our conversations had always revolved around Sophie. Curiosity eventually convinced me to accept. We met at a small cafe near downtown Columbus. When I arrived, Jason was already seated. For the first time in years, he looked less like a confident executive and more like an ordinary person reflecting on his choices. After a brief conversation about Sophie, silence settled between us. Finally, he spoke. I have been thinking about a lot of things lately. I nodded. The announcement changed more than I expected. How so? He looked down at his coffee. It made me realize how often I confused appearances with reality. I remained silent. He continued. When we were married, I always thought success looked a certain way. Bigger house, better car, more visible achievements. He shook his head slowly. Meanwhile, you were building something real. There was no bitterness in his voice. No defensiveness. Just honesty. We all learn at different times, I said. He smiled faintly. I suppose I learned later than most. As the conversation continued, something unexpected happened. For the first time since our divorce, we spoke without old arguments hiding beneath every sentence. Neither of us was trying to win. Neither of us needed validation. We were simply two people acknowledging how differently life had unfolded from what either of us imagined. When we eventually left the cafe, Jason stopped before walking to his car. For what it is worth, he said, I am proud of what you built. Years earlier, those words might have meant everything. Now they simply felt nice to hear. Thank you, I replied. Driving home, I realized the story was never really about a building. It was never about ownership records or redevelopment projects. It was about perspective. Some people see a small apartment and assume failure. Others see opportunity, purpose, and freedom. The difference is not what exists in front of them. The difference is how deeply they choose to look. And for the first time in a very long time, it seemed everyone involved was finally beginning to see the full picture. In the months that followed, the redevelopment project moved from plans on paper to visible progress throughout the property. Construction schedules were carefully organized to minimize disruption for residents. New landscaping appeared first. Fresh walkways replaced cracked pavement. Updated lighting improved safety throughout the grounds. The changes were gradual, but people noticed. More importantly, they felt included in the process. Every major decision was explained to residents before implementation. Community meetings became regular events. Questions were answered openly. Concerns were addressed honestly. My father used to say that trust is built one conversation at a time, and I thought about those words often. One evening, after a community meeting, several residents remained behind to talk. Mrs. Henderson smiled as she looked around the renovated gathering room. Your father would have been proud of this, she said. Her comment stayed with me long after everyone had gone home. The truth was that much of what people praised had started with lessons he taught decades earlier. I simply continued the work. Around the same time, Sophie began spending more time with me at the building. Not because she was interested in ownership or investments, but because she enjoyed seeing how everything worked. She attended meetings, asked questions, and spoke with residents. One Saturday morning, we walked through the courtyard together while contractors prepared for another phase of improvements. I always thought success looked different, she admitted. What do you mean? I asked. She looked around at families sitting outside, children playing nearby, and neighbors talking with one another. I thought it was about having the biggest house or the most expensive things. I smiled. A lot of people think that. She nodded thoughtfully. But this feels more important. Her words made me unexpectedly emotional. Not because she was agreeing with me, but because she was discovering her own definition of success. That mattered far more. Meanwhile, Jason seemed different as well. Not dramatically different, but noticeably more reflective. Occasionally, we crossed paths during events related to Sophie or the redevelopment project. The conversations felt easier now, less competitive, less guarded. One afternoon, he visited the property for a scheduled business discussion involving financing updates. After the meeting concluded, we found ourselves walking through the courtyard together. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he glanced toward the apartment building and shook his head. I still cannot believe it, he said. I laughed softly. You have said that several times. Because it is true. He looked around. You build all of this without needing anyone's approval. The statement surprised me, not because it was flattering, but because it revealed how much his perspective had changed. Years earlier, he measured success through recognition. Now he seemed to understand the value of purpose. I had help, I replied. My father taught me almost everything. Jason nodded slowly. Maybe I spent too much time trying to impress people. There was no bitterness in his voice. Only honesty. Most people learn eventually, I said. He smiled. Some of us take longer. As autumn arrived, the property continued evolving. New community spaces opened. Residents organized events. Families gathered outdoors during weekends. What pleased me most was that the building never lost its identity. The improvements enhanced the community rather than replacing it. One evening, I stood near the entrance watching residents return home after work. A young couple carried groceries upstairs. Children raced across the courtyard laughing. An elderly neighbor waved as she entered the lobby. The scene felt ordinary, yet deeply meaningful. Years earlier, when Jason mocked my apartment, he saw a small living space inside an aging building. What he failed to see was the life surrounding it. The relationships, the stability, the purpose. Those things had always mattered more than appearances. My phone buzzed with a message from Sophie. It contained a photograph she had taken earlier that day. The image showed the courtyard filled with residents during a community event. Beneath the photo, she wrote a simple sentence. "Now I understand what you were building." I stared at the message for several moments. Out of everything that had happened over the past year, those words meant the most. Because money can build structures. Investments can create opportunities. Ownership can provide control. But understanding is different. Understanding passes from one generation to the next. As evenings settled over the property, lights began appearing in windows throughout the building. The same building people once underestimated. The same building that quietly held a story nobody expected. And standing there beneath the glow of those lights, I realized the greatest reward was never proving anyone wrong. It was knowing that the people who mattered most finally understood what had been there all along. Winter arrived gradually, bringing cold mornings and early sunsets to Columbus. By then, much of the redevelopment work had become visible throughout the property. Residents who had lived there for years often stopped to admire the improvements while sharing stories about how the community had changed. What impressed me most was not the new landscaping, upgraded facilities, or modernized common areas. It was the growing sense of pride among the people who called the building home. One Saturday afternoon, the residents organized a holiday gathering in the newly renovated community room. Families brought homemade food. Children decorated cookies. Neighbors exchanged gifts and stories. As I moved through the room greeting people, I realized how different the atmosphere felt compared to years earlier. Back then, many residents viewed the property as a temporary stop on their journey somewhere else. Now they spoke about it as a place they genuinely cared about. That shift meant more to me than any financial report ever could. During the event, Sophie helped organize activities for younger children. Watching her interact with residents reminded me how much she had matured over the past year. The revelations surrounding the property had changed her perspective, but they had not changed her character. If anything, she seemed more grounded than before. At one point, she joined me near a window overlooking the courtyard. Snowflakes drifted softly through the evening air, while colorful holiday lights reflected against freshly renovated walkways. "I have been thinking about something," she said. "What is that?" I asked. "You could have lived anywhere." I smiled. "That is true. But you stayed here." Her voice carried genuine curiosity. Why? The answer came easily because I had asked myself the same question many times. Because this place reminded me of what mattered. She looked around the room, filled with laughter and conversation. People, I agreed. Later that evening, after most guests had gone home, I helped clean up decorations and tables. As I carried supplies toward a storage room, I noticed Jason standing near the entrance. He had attended the gathering because Sophie invited him. In the past, events like this might have felt awkward. Now they felt surprisingly normal. "Quite a turnout," he said. It was. He watched several residents saying goodbye to one another. "I think I finally understand something." I waited. When we were married, I spent years chasing bigger opportunities because I thought bigger automatically meant better. He gestured toward the community room. "You were building something entirely different." There was no need to respond immediately. Sometimes people need space to finish their own thoughts. "I used to think success was about what people saw," he continued. "Now I think it is more about what remains when nobody is looking." I smiled. "That is a lesson worth learning." He laughed softly. "You sound exactly like your father." The comment surprised me because it was true. Over time, I had become more like him than I realized. After Jason left, I stood alone in the lobby for several minutes. Through the glass entrance doors, I could see snow beginning to cover the courtyard. Lights glowed warmly from apartment windows throughout the building. Every window represented a different family, a different story, a different future. Years earlier, after the divorce, I worried about whether I would be able to create a meaningful life on my own. Looking back, I realized the answer had never depended on money or property. It depended on purpose. Purpose gives direction when circumstances change. Purpose remains when appearances shift. Purpose survives disappointment. A few weeks later, the city recognized the redevelopment project during a community development ceremony. Several officials praised the balance between modernization and resident protection. Reporters asked questions. Photographs were taken. Speeches were delivered. Yet the moment that stayed with me happened afterward. As guests were leaving, a young woman approached me. She explained that she had recently started a small property management business and wanted advice. "Everyone keeps telling me to focus on growth," she said. "What do you think matters most?" I thought for a moment before answering. "Focus on people first. Growth usually follows." She thanked me and walked away. Driving home that evening, I reflected on how much had changed since the day Jason mocked my apartment. At the time, his words seemed to reveal what he thought about me. In reality, they revealed how limited his understanding had been. Sometimes life does not require revenge. Sometimes the truth arrives quietly, patiently, and completely on its own schedule. And when it does, the lesson becomes impossible to ignore. Spring arrived with warmer weather and a sense of renewal that seemed to spread throughout the entire property. Construction crews completed the final phases of the redevelopment project, and residents gradually settled into the improved spaces. New gardens bloomed along walkways. Fresh paint brightened common areas. Community rooms hosted more events than ever before. Yet what pleased me most was not the physical transformation. It was the feeling that people had become more connected to one another. One Saturday morning, I attended a resident breakfast held in the renovated courtyard. Long tables were filled with families, retirees, young professionals, and children. Conversations flowed easily. Neighbors who once passed each other without speaking now exchanged stories and shared coffee together. Standing there, I remembered the countless meetings, decisions, and challenges that had brought us to this moment. None of it happened overnight. Every improvement required patience, planning, and trust. As the event continued, several residents approached to thank me. I appreciated their kindness, but I always reminded them that communities are not built by one person. They are built by everyone who chooses to care. Around midday, Sophie joined me carrying a tray of pastries from a local bakery. She had recently been accepted into a university program focused on urban planning and community development. The news made me incredibly proud, not because of the accomplishment itself, but because she had discovered something that genuinely inspired her. "You know this is your fault, right?" she joked as we sat together beneath a shaded pavilion. "My fault. You spent years teaching me that buildings are really about people." I laughed. "That sounds like something my father would say." "Exactly," she smiled. Apparently, the lesson worked. Watching her talk about future projects and possibilities filled me with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Success means different things at different stages of life. Years earlier, I measured success by survival after my divorce. Later, I measured it by stability and purpose. Now, sitting beside my daughter, I realized another definition had emerged. Success was seeing values continue beyond your own lifetime. A few weeks later, the city hosted a public ceremony recognizing several redevelopment projects that had positively impacted local communities. Representatives from various organizations attended. Residents from our property were invited as well. During the event, speakers discussed housing, neighborhood revitalization, and responsible development. When our project received recognition, applause filled the room. Yet the moment that stayed with me happened afterward. A longtime resident named Mr. Reynolds approached carrying a small framed photograph. "I thought you might want this," he said. The image showed the building nearly 20 years earlier. The landscaping was sparse. The exterior looked worn. The courtyard appeared empty. "I took this when I first moved here," he explained. Then he handed me a second photograph taken recently. The difference was remarkable, not because the building looked more expensive, but because it looked alive. Families occupied outdoor spaces. Gardens flourished. Community events filled the courtyard. "You did not just improve the property," he said. "You helped people believe in it again." His words stayed with me for days. Later that month, I found myself standing beside Jason during another event involving Sophie. We watched as she discussed future career plans with friends and teachers. "She has grown up fast," he said. "She has." He smiled. "I think she inherited your patience." I'm not sure she would agree. We both laughed. Then his expression became thoughtful. "You know, when all of this started, I thought the biggest surprise was discovering who owned the building." He paused. "Now I think the bigger surprise was realizing how much I misunderstood what success actually looks like." The comment felt sincere. More importantly, it felt earned. Growth is meaningful only when it changes behavior. Over the past year, I had seen that change in him. Not perfection, not transformation into a completely different person, just growth. Real growth usually happens that way. Slowly, quietly, one lesson at a time. That evening, I returned to my apartment and stood by the same window where I had spent countless nights reflecting on life after my divorce. The view remained familiar. The courtyard below glowed beneath soft lighting. Residents walked along pathways. Children played near benches while parents watched nearby. Looking out across the property, I realized something remarkable. The building itself had never been the true story. The true story was what happened when assumptions collided with reality. The true story was what happened when people looked beyond appearances. And the true story was still unfolding every day, not through dramatic revelations, but through ordinary moments shared by a community that finally understood its own value. As summer approached, life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. The redevelopment project was no longer the center of attention because it had become part of everyday life. Residents enjoyed the improvements naturally, without constantly discussing them. Children treated the renovated playground as though it had always been there. Neighbors gathered in community spaces without thinking about what existed before. In many ways, that was the greatest compliment any project could receive. Success had blended into ordinary life. One evening, I attended a resident appreciation event organized entirely by volunteers. The courtyard was filled with folding tables, string lights, and homemade food. Local musicians played soft music while families laughed and shared stories. As I walked through the crowd, several people stopped me to say hello. Some had lived in the building for decades. Others had arrived only recently. Yet all of them seemed connected by a sense of belonging that had grown stronger over the years. Near sunset, I found myself sitting beside Mr. Reynolds on a bench overlooking the gardens. He watched children playing nearby and smiled. "You know what I like most?" he asked. "What is that?" "Nobody talks about ownership anymore." I laughed. "That is true." He nodded. "Because people are too busy living their lives." His answer stayed with me. There had been a time when the revelation about the building felt enormous. News articles had been written. Assumptions had been challenged. Conversations had changed. Yet eventually, life moved forward. The truth settled into place, and people returned to what mattered most: relationships, community, family. A few days later, Sophie and I spent an afternoon touring her future university campus. She would begin classes in the fall, and excitement seemed to follow her everywhere. Walking across the campus together, I noticed how confident she had become. Not because she had all the answers, but because she no longer felt pressure to impress anyone. "I have been thinking about something," she said as we passed a row of historic buildings. "Another deep observation?" I asked playfully. She laughed. "Maybe." Then she became serious. "Growing up, I used to compare everything. Everyone does that sometimes. I compared houses, cars, jobs, money." She looked at me. "I think a lot of people spend years comparing without understanding what they are actually measuring." Her words reminded me of a lesson life had taught both Jason and me in very different ways. "And what do you think matters now?" I asked. Sophie smiled. "Whether you are building something meaningful." I could not have answered better myself. Later that month, Jason invited both of us to dinner. It was not a special occasion. No celebration. No announcement. Just dinner. That simple fact revealed how much had changed. During the meal, conversation flowed easily. We talked about Sophie leaving for college, future plans, favorite memories, and even old family stories. At one point, Jason looked across the table and shook his head. "If someone had told me 2 years ago that we would be sitting here like this, I would not have believed them." "Life surprises people," I said. He smiled. "That is certainly true." There was no tension in the room. No need to revisit old arguments. The past remained part of our story, but it no longer controlled the present. As I drove home afterward, I reflected on how unusual that felt. Many people think healing arrives through dramatic moments. In reality, it often arrives quietly. One ordinary conversation at a time. One honest reflection at a time. One small choice at a time. Several weeks later, I discovered an old photograph while organizing paperwork in my apartment. The picture showed me standing beside my father years before his passing. We were outside the building on a bright summer afternoon. At the time, I knew very little about ownership responsibilities. I certainly never imagined the path my life would eventually take. Yet looking at the photograph, I noticed something interesting. My father was smiling in exactly the same way he always smiled when he believed something important would reveal itself eventually. Not through force, not through confrontation, simply through time. I placed the photograph on a shelf near the window where I could see it each morning. Outside, the courtyard remained full of life. Residents moved through their routines. Children played. Neighbors talked. Families created memories. And standing there, I realized my father had been right all along. Truth does not need to chase attention. Purpose does not need to demand recognition. When something is genuinely valuable, time eventually reveals it. The challenge is having the patience to let that happen. The first week after Sophie left for college felt quieter than I expected. For years, my schedule revolved around balancing work, family, and the countless responsibilities that come with raising a child. Suddenly, the apartment seemed larger. The evenings felt calmer. Even the familiar sounds of the building appeared different. I knew this transition would come eventually, but knowing something and experiencing it are often very different things. One Saturday morning, I made coffee and sat beside the window overlooking the courtyard. The same view that had accompanied me through divorce, uncertainty, success, and unexpected revelations now greeted me during another new chapter. Residents crossed the pathways below carrying groceries, walking dogs, or heading toward weekend activities. Life continued moving forward, just as it always had. My phone buzzed with a message from Sophie. It included a photograph of her standing beside several new friends on campus. Beneath the image she wrote, "Everything feels unfamiliar and exciting at the same time." I smiled immediately because I understood exactly what she meant. Growth often feels that way, a mixture of uncertainty and possibility. I replied with a simple message reminding her to enjoy every moment. Later that afternoon, I attended a planning meeting regarding future community programs at the property. Although the redevelopment project was complete, the work of strengthening the community never truly ended. Residents proposed educational workshops, seasonal events, and volunteer initiatives. Listening to their ideas reminded me why I loved this work. Buildings eventually age. Renovations eventually become outdated. But relationships continue evolving. During a break, one of our younger residents approached me. She had recently graduated from college and was beginning her first professional job. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. How did you know what direction to take after everything changed?" The question was broader than she realized. It could have referred to careers, relationships, family, or life itself. I did not always know, I answered honestly. Most of the time, I simply focused on the next right step. She seemed surprised by the answer. Perhaps she expected a more complicated explanation. Yet life rarely moves forward through giant breakthroughs. More often, progress comes from consistent small decisions. That evening, Jason called unexpectedly. We spoke briefly about Sophie, classes, and campus life. Before ending the conversation, he paused. "I have been meaning to tell you something." "All right." Watching everything unfold over the past year changed me more than I realized. I listened quietly. For a long time, I thought achievement was something people recognized publicly. He laughed, softly. "Now I think the most important achievements are often invisible." The comment reminded me of our conversation after the redevelopment announcement. Back then, he was still processing what had happened. Now his understanding seemed deeper, less focused on the surprise and more focused on the lesson. "People keep learning," I said. Hopefully. After the call ended, I returned to the window and looked across the courtyard. The lights from dozens of apartments glowed against the evening sky. Every window represented someone facing challenges, hopes, disappointments, victories, and dreams. No matter how much we know about another person, we rarely know the full story. That realization sat at the heart of everything that had happened. Months later, The property hosted an anniversary celebration marking 1 year since the redevelopment announcement. Residents gathered outdoors beneath decorative lights while local musicians performed. Families filled the courtyard. Children played games. Neighbors shared food and laughter. Looking around, it was difficult to believe how much had changed. Yet in many ways, the most meaningful things remained exactly the same. Community, connection, belonging. During the event, Sophie returned home for a weekend visit from college. As we walked through the courtyard together, she stopped and looked around carefully. "You know what is strange?" she asked. "What?" "A year ago, everyone was shocked when they learned the truth." I nodded. "And now nobody talks about it anymore." Her observation was correct. The revelation that once dominated conversations had become just another part of history. People no longer focused on ownership because they were busy living their lives. "That is probably how it should be," I said. Sophie smiled. "I think so too." As the evening continued, I stood quietly beneath the glow of courtyard lights and watched residents enjoying the community we had spent years building. In that moment, I understood something important. Life is not measured by the assumptions people make about you. It is not measured by titles, appearances, or first impressions. Life is measured by the impact you leave behind when the noise fades away. And looking around at the people gathered there that evening, I realized that was always the only measure that truly mattered. A year later, on a quiet autumn evening, I found myself sitting on the same bench overlooking the courtyard where so many important moments had unfolded. The air carried the familiar scent of fallen leaves, and golden light from the setting sun reflected across the windows of the building. Residents moved through their routines just as they always had. Children laughed as they hurried home for dinner. Neighbors paused to exchange greetings. Dogs tugged gently on leashes as their owners walked along the pathways. Everything felt peaceful. Watching the scene before me, I realized how differently I viewed life compared to the woman I had been years earlier. After my divorce, I believed I needed to rebuild everything. I thought success meant recovering what had been lost. I thought happiness depended on proving I could survive alone. Looking back, I understood that those beliefs came from fear. Real growth began only when I stopped measuring my life against someone else's expectations. My phone buzzed softly. A message from Sophie appeared on the screen. She had just completed another successful semester at college and attached a photograph of herself standing beside classmates during a community planning project. Beneath the image she wrote, "I think I finally found exactly what I want to do." Reading those words brought an immediate smile to my face. Every parent hopes their child discovers a path that feels meaningful. Not easy, not perfect, meaningful. That was always the goal. A few minutes later, Sophie called. We spoke about classes, future opportunities, and the project she was helping design. Her excitement was impossible to miss. Before ending the conversation, she became unusually quiet. "Mom." "Yes." "Can I tell you something?" "Of course." For a long time, I thought the biggest lesson from everything that happened was not judging people by appearances. I listened carefully, but I think there is a bigger lesson now. "What is that?" She paused. "Sometimes people spend years searching for something they already have." After the call ended, I sat there thinking about her words. In many ways, she was right. Jason spent years searching for validation through achievement. I spent years searching for certainty after the divorce. Even many residents who lived in the building searched for reasons to believe in themselves. Yet confidence, purpose, and belonging were never things waiting to be discovered somewhere else. They were built gradually through choices, relationships, and perspective. A few days later, the community hosted its annual fall festival. The event had become one of the property's most beloved traditions. Families decorated booths. Local businesses donated supplies. Volunteers organized games and activities. The courtyard filled with laughter and conversation from morning until evening. As I moved through the crowd, countless residents stopped to share updates about their lives. Some talked about new jobs. Others discussed grandchildren, vacations, or personal goals. Every conversation reminded me that the building was never just a property. It was a collection of stories. Thousands of moments connected by shared space and shared experiences. Near sunset, Jason arrived to help with cleanup after the event. By then, our relationship had evolved into something simple and healthy. Not because the past disappeared, but because neither of us remained trapped by it. As we folded tables together, He looked around the courtyard and smiled. "You know what is funny?" he said. "What?" "I used to think this place was small." I laughed. "I remember." He shook his head. "Now it feels bigger than most places I have ever seen." The comment carried more meaning than he probably realized. Because size was never measured by square footage. Impact was never measured by appearance. The things that matter most in life rarely fit inside traditional definitions. After he left, I remained behind for a few minutes. The courtyard was nearly empty now. String lights glowed softly overhead. Leaves drifted across the pathways. The building stood quietly against the evening sky, just as it had for decades. Looking at it, I thought about every chapter of the journey. The divorce, the assumptions, the hidden ownership, the unexpected revelation, the lessons learned afterward. None of those moments alone defined the story. Together, however, they revealed something important. Life has a way of exposing the difference between what people believe and what is actually true. Sometimes that truth arrives dramatically. Other times it appears slowly over years. Either way, it eventually finds its way to the surface. As darkness settled over the courtyard, apartment lights began appearing one by one throughout the building. Families gathered for dinner. Friends visited neighbors. Ordinary life continued behind every window. And standing there, surrounded by the quiet evidence of lives moving forward, I felt grateful. Not because anyone finally understood my success. Not because assumptions had been proven wrong. But because I learned that genuine fulfillment never comes from changing how others see you. It comes from knowing who you are long before they figure it out.